Hi, welcome to my presentation on the Teomoxtli. I think this is a fascinating topic, and I'm going to be introducing stories and ideas that I can guarantee that you will never have heard before. Things that have been hidden, in a sense, for a lot of the history of mankind. And I would ask you to like and subscribe my video because you're going to be notified. I'm going to be creating new content. You'll be notified when I create new videos for this. So let's go ahead and begin. The Teomoxtli, it's called the Divine Book. It's, in my opinion, it's the history of the Book of Mormon as it is told by the ancient Mesoamerican natives. So who were they? Who were these people? When you look at their history, they left their homeland filled with white people, white fair-skinned people. They followed a compass to a promised land. They sailed on a ship to get to their promised land. They were converted to Christianity. They apostatized from Christianity. And they were destroyed defending a hill as a people. So who were these people? They were the Toltecs. So we've heard a lot about the Toltecs, but we don't know a lot about them. I mean, they were kind of a people that they were just here at one point in the Mesoamerican area, and they disappeared. So where did they come from? What did they believe? What did the Toltecs? They had a religion. They followed a religion. So what happened to them? And why does their history match the Book of Mormon? That's where it gets really interesting. So I'm going to introduce you to some of these writers. They are ancient historians from the Spanish conquest. Bernardino de Sahagún was one of the first. He was a Spanish missionary to the Aztecs. Diego Duran, his father brought him over to the Mexico area when he was very young, and he lived among the Aztec children. He grew up among them. Jose de Acosta was another missionary. Ixtlilxochitl was an Aztec prince and a Catholic adherent. He was royalty on both sides, and so he records his people's history. And there's many more. And the interesting thing about this is that Joseph Smith could not have known any of these writers. These writers, they wrote in Spanish, and they sent all of their books to Spain, and their books were written in Spanish and housed in Spain's museums, and they weren't even found until after the Book of Mormon was published. And so we have modern day scholars who quote them, but they're all after the Book of Mormon. And I'll be going over some of these writers because they quote the history, and it's really fascinating. It all centers around a man. His name was Tolpiltzin. So Tolpiltzin, he was basically their god, but he was also like a priest or a high priest. Diego Duran, the one who lived with the Aztec people and grew up among them, he said, his name was Tolpiltzin, our Lord, also known as Papa, high priest known to the Aztecs as Hoymak, who lived in Tula. So you're going to see several of these ideas come up around Tula. Tolpiltzin is saying, or Duran is saying that Tolpiltzin is Hoymak, and they're the same person. And so when we look at, well, who was Tolpiltzin and Hoymak, Ixtlilxochitl, he's the Aztec prince, he says, and when they were at the height of their prosperity, meaning in Tula, a man arrived in this land who some called Quetzalcoatl and others Hoymak. So Ixtlilxochitl says that Hoymak is Quetzalcoatl. Well, we can go even one step further, and Bernardino de Sahagún says these ancients worshipped an idol called Quetzalcoatl, who was a ruler at Tula, and you named him Tolpiltzin. The things which he did were like miracles, yet he will return. He is still expected. So we have this same being who is named three different names. They're all the same person, and I'm going to show how that person is Jesus Christ. And there's a lot of evidence for that. So the Teomoxtli is the divine book, and Xochitl was quoted, and he says, "I want to talk to you of Huimak the Elder." So remember, this is one of the names of Quetzalcoatl and Topiltzin is Huimak. Huimak the Elder. What they did was they started to conflate their prophets with their gods, and so you get a lot of this kind of overlap, and they don't understand who's really talking. But so Huimak the Elder, he's an astrologer and prophet who lived many centuries ago, who being almost 300 years of age, felt that death was coming. He gathered all the Toltec stories existing since the creation of the world, and he had these written in a book. So this book talked about the creation, where he recorded all his work and prosperity, the life of kings, their laws, and good government. He wrote all the axioms of all the knowledge, of the ancient knowledge, the metaphors, and the philosophy, and recorded all the astrological knowledge, architectural data, and secret arts of this time. After summarizing everything, he sealed the book and branded it Teomoxtli, meaning in Nahuatl, the divine book. So he summarized this book, and then he sealed it up. That sounds exactly like the golden plates which Joseph Smith saw. Here's another story of this book, or of a similar book. He says, the Atomies were in possession of a book handed down from father to son and guarded by persons of importance whose duty it was to explain it. Each page of that book had 2 columns, and besides these columns, between these columns, were paintings which represented Christ crucified. So the Indians had the natives had no concept of crucifixion. They didn't understand what it was to torture people. They weren't like the Romans. They were a barbaric people, but they also were they didn't have torture. They just didn't understand the concept. And so what we see here is that we see a painting which represents Quetzalcoatl crucified, but he's on an X-shaped cross. And the X-shaped cross shows that, they didn't know what a cross looked like. Well, the old man continued and said, "Were it in existence, yet it would be evident that the teachings of the book and the preachings of the friar, the Catholic friar, were one and the same. But the venerable heirloom had perished in the ground where the guardians had buried it." Wow. Here we have a Pre-Columbian Codex. It's if you remember, it was the duty of the elders to look at the pictures and to interpret the pictures and to share the story. And so this is called Codex Boturini, and it's known as the Tale of the Meshika Migration. It's a Pre-Columbian Codex, so it had nothing to do with the Spanish. This is what they had. These are their histories before the Spanish arrived. So one of the things that kind of links the histories with this document is Xochitl writes, "In the year of Teoamoxtli." Now, the year Teoamoxtli is demonstrated by this this mark of a year over here, and it's 1 flint. It stands for 1 flint. Se is 1, Teoamoxtli is flint, which also is representative of sacrifice. So in the year of 1 sacrifice, as had already been declared, the Toltecs left their homeland and nation in exile, fleeing as best they could, that towards where the sun rises was a long and prosperous land. Now think about it. So the sun rises in the east. So they had to follow, or they had to travel towards the sun, which means they would be coming from the west and traveling to the east towards where the sun rises. They were guided to a promised land. Basically, their God commanded them to leave the country, and he said he would give them a land abounding with gold, silver, precious stones, feathers, and rich mantles, whereupon they went forth, carrying their idol with them. Now, this is kind of another shot of the same picture that I showed previously, but right there is a picture of their idol. It's a little bird man who's kind of teaching them, and he's talking to them, telling them where to go. And to me, it totally reminds me of the Liahona in the Book of Mormon. And they didn't understand what this object was. They just called it an idol, but it was a kind of a compass that led them here. And so it says, through the idol, their God prophesied through them in secret all the events that would take place on their journey, preaching to them the conduct that they were to follow and ceremonies and rites to be observed in honor of their divinity. This they did in all the places where they set up camp. So this is one author, this is Diego Duran writing, and this is confirmed by Jose de Acosta. And he says that they did not advance nor move without commandment from this idol. He gave them notice when to march and when to stay in place, wherein they wholly obeyed him. There cannot be a more perfect parallel with the Liahona, and Joseph Smith could not have known this. This is an amazing parallel with the Book of Mormon. So another parallel is we go back to the Codex Botorini, and they came by ship. Isla Xochitl says, after having sailed along the coasts of the various lands down to the South Sea coast of what is now California, they came to a sea they named Huitlapalan. According to the aforementioned histories, they came from the west. Remember, they're traveling east. They came from the west, and they're sailing along the coasts of the south until they reach the South Sea. Now, what is the South Sea? Well, if we look at this, we kind of think, well, the Nephites, where did they come from? Well, if they came from Jerusalem up here and they left and followed the path to the east, and they sailed along the coasts of the lands, they would have been able to stop and replenish and be able to find food. We imagine that they sailed right across the Pacific Ocean. Well, that's not likely. They were probably sailing along the coasts and the land. And this is exactly what we see with the Toltecs. So when you look at, he says, they came from the west, sailing along the coast of the South Sea. Now, the South Sea, if you look at the maps that were printed, that were drawn around that time, they actually name the Great South Sea here on the map. This is another interesting parallel. They came from fair-skinned people. If you look at the difference, we see these people are drawn in, they're dark-skinned, but where they left from fair-skinned people. And this is Diego Duran. He says that these people, like the others who populated the country, departed from the 7 caves in a land where they had lived, called Aztlan. This name means whiteness. Because of this, the people were originally called Aztec, which means people of whiteness. Now, this is important because we think of the Aztecs and we kind of confuse them because they were called the Aztecs in Mexico when the Spanish first arrived and Cortes conquered them. But Diego Duran is saying that these were their ancestors, that the Aztecs were the people where they came from. And we know this because the Nahuatl word for white is actually Iztec. So we have a direct correlation here between white people and fair-skinned people, which is where in Jerusalem they were fair-skinned. That's where they left from. He continues, he goes on, Diego Duran says, thus we can almost positively confirm that they were Jews and Hebrews, and I would not commit a great error if I were to state this as fact, considering their way of life, their ceremonies, their rites and superstitions, their omens and hypocrisies, so akin to the characteristic of those of the Jews. In no way do they seem to differ. It seems to me that even without other explanation, we have here sufficient proof that these Indians descended from the Hebrews. Another writer, a little later, he actually lived among the North American Native Indians. And he says that I was forced to believe them lineally descended from Israelites. And he goes through his whole book is about how the American Indians were Jews. And he says, observation and arguments in proof of the American Indians being descended from the Jews. Now, we actually have DNA proof of this, DNA evidence to show that they descended from the Jews. The haplogroup R, which is also R1 M173, subclade M173, scientists are clueless as to how it got there. I mean, if you look at the haplogroup R, scientists claim that they came over from Asia, but there's no haplogroup R in Asia. It's completely clear over here. So how did they get there? Well, it's one of the most controversial DNA science right now. They don't know. They don't understand this. But and even further, when we look at the origins of haplogroup R, it occurred right here, right smack in the Middle East of the northern kingdoms of Israel, right where Assyrians took away the 10 tribes. This is we have DNA evidence here. So, and there's been a lot of articles written on this. The Cherokees, why the Cherokees could be Jewish. They bear bona fide Middle East Jewish genetic markers. Another one, almost 25% of Latinos have significant Jewish DNA. They have actually a genetic defect that is similar to the defect or the genetic defect of a mutation in the Ashkenazi Jews. And again, we have the Cherokee Indians have found a new gene among a quarter of the this is the Cherokee Indians among a quarter of them, a gene largely found in the Middle East. A new study examining the DNA of thousands of Latin Americans revealed the extent of the likely of Sephardic Jewish ancestry. So this is both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, more widespread than previously thought. Great surprise! Nearly 1/3 of Native American genes come from West Eurasia, people linked to the Middle East and Europe, rather than entirely from the East Asians as previously thought. Now, why is this a surprise? Joseph Smith predicted this 200 years ago. There are 7 tribes that left from Aztlan. If you count here, we see that there are 7 houses with one primary house. So there are 7 leaders, and Ixtlilxochitl actually names these leaders. He says they brought with them 7 leaders. And I'm not going to try to pronounce all these, but we have 7. And 7 is kind of this running narrative of the number of people who came over with the Toltecs. So we have another. So this is the Teomoxtli, the 7 caves, the Teomoxtli. And again, there are 7 leaders that came over, 7 peoples that came over and became the Aztecs. Well, guess what? There are 7 tribes in the Book of Mormon. When we start naming them, there's 7. There's the Nephites, the Lamanites, the Jacobites, Josephites, Zoramites, Lemuelites, and the Ishmaelites. We have 7 leaders. Not only that, but we actually have 8 leaders in the Book of Mormon. But they're not named as a tribe because they joined with the others. They are called the Mulekites. Well, guess what? If we go to the next page after they arrived in the Promised Land, we have 8 tribes. 7 left. There are 8 tribes in the New World. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Meet the eighth tribe. Those who inhabited this new world in the Third Age were the Olmecas and Xicalancas. And according to their histories, they came to Potonchan in ships or boats from the east. So they traveled from the east to the west. They came across the Atlantic Ocean. And from there they went out to settle the land and on the banks of the river Atoyac. Well, that's exactly what happened in the Book of Mormon. The Mulekites came and they first landed, and where they first landed, it was so desolate that they moved south. So the people of Zarahemla, they went up to a south wilderness, basically, with desolation being up above. And that's easily possible because they had navigable rivers back then. We think that the Nephites they traveled everywhere on foot. Well, no, there was these navigable rivers that you could actually take all over the place. Well, when the eighth tribe first arrived, remember they came from the east and they came to the west. They found another people there that had preceded them even. So they found what they called giants, or what's called Kinametsin. And they talk about how that they were held captive by the Kinametsin, but they eventually killed off the Kinametsin. Well, the Kinametsin is kind of a running narrative of the people who preceded the second group that was there, which is the eighth tribe. So the Kinametsin were large people, and they tell of the first group. They say that their histories relate that their great leader and hero god Wotan, or Woden, had assisted at building of the Tower of Babel, and that they, after the confusion of the tongues, he led a portion of the dispersed people to America, where he established the kingdom of Xibalba and built the city of Palenque. It seems that Wotan proceeded by divine command to America, and there portioned out the land. Who does this sound like? Sounds like the Jaredites. So the Kinametsin, it's a favorite one of many parts of Mexico. They have these gigantic bones, and they found all of these bones, and they started to confuse them with men. And so giants were actually, a lot of scientists say that these giants were mammoths, were large mammoths and elephants, and that these mammoths and elephants were actually, they helped to build their cities. Says this is a Doris Hayden. She was a translator for Diego Duran, and she says that who other than the greater than men, giants or gods, could have constructed the pyramids of such extraordinary proportions. Well, these mammoth bones, they found these mammoth bones, and they also found that they were found together with man-made instruments. So one of the favorite arguments of critics is that, well, mammoths and horses and all these other animals were killed off by the Ice Age, right? How did the Ice Age, how did the the ice, it's here up in Canada, how did it kill off all of these animals in Mexico? I'll let you try to answer that. So in Mexico, we have these graveyards where they have found mammoths, camels, horses, bison, and other types of animals that were supposedly extinct by an ice age. Again, how does the ice age reach Mexico? But they have more than one. They have these other digs, not just one. We have multiple digs. In the 1970s, workers they found a mammoth skeleton. In 2012, additional mammoths. So the position of these bones suggests to scientists that mammoths may have been partially cut up by a human group. Now, how is that possible if they were extinct before humans got there, or if an ice age killed them off? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. These things existed before. So we know that there's three groups that came to the area. Xochitl says that the Toltec nation was the third to settle this new Spain, counting the giants or the Kinametsan, likely those who rode mammoths, and the first, and the first. So the giants were the first group, the Olmecas and Xicalancas were the second, and then the Toltecs were the third. Well, if you think about it, the Jaredites were the first. They came from the Tower of Babel, domesticated and used elements and mammoths. The Mulekites, they landed at Desolation and they moved south. So here we have, they landed, the Jaredites were in this area. They killed themselves off. They were destroyed, and they moved south down into the wilderness, down into the mountains up here. That's where Zarahemla is. The third group, the Nephites, were the third because Mosiah was commanded to leave his people, and they traveled up into the Zarahemla area, and they united with the people of Zarahemla, and they settled around the bountiful area. And so this is all bountiful. So again, this is leaving the land of Nephi. So Mosiah was commanded to, being warned of the Lord, that he should flee out of the land of Nephi, and as many would hearken unto the voice of the Lord should depart out of the land with him into the mountains. And they were led by the power of his arm through the mountains until they came down into the land which is called Zarahemla. And they discovered a people who were called the people of Zarahemla. Now the people where they left, the people they left from, they eventually became naked. They were the naked Lamanites. And now their heads of the Lamanites were shorn, and they were naked, save there was a skin which was girded about their loins. Well, guess what? We actually have a similar story in the histories of the Native Mesoamericans. So instead of being naked, they actually, their God told them, that he says, so whoever goes skinny dipping, you go out, you take their clothes and leave them and take off, go away. So there was a group that, well, yeah, they went out and they took off their clothes and they went skinny dipping to bathe, and so all of the other people, they stole their clothes and they followed their God, and they took off and went away. And so when the people who were naked, they came out, they couldn't find them. They eventually just said, oh, okay, we don't know where to go, so we're going to just stay here and settle the land. And so they remained, it says, those who tell this story say that they remained dressed only in their own skin, men as well as women. The stories, the parallels here are just amazing. So they left the naked ones. Swords. I show this here, and this is not the way that the Nephites, the swords were. That's not what they looked like. They looked like that. That is called the Macoitl. The Macoitl is a wooden sword with obsidian blades around the sword, and it's a very sharp sword. It would actually take the heads of a horse off. Is what the Spanish described this sword as. Now, what's interesting about this sword is it's made of wood. Now, you can't stain a metal sword with blood, but you can stain a wooden sword with blood. And the Lamanites, they had these wooden swords, because they said, now my best beloved brethren, since God hath taken away our stains, and our swords have become bright, let us stain our swords no more with the blood of our brethren. How amazing is that? I mean, Joseph Smith could not have known about the Macoitl, and yet here we have the swords that are stained with blood because they're wooden, and you can stain a wooden sword with blood. They also have this interesting story about a deer. It's a two-headed deer. It falls from the sky, and a two-headed deer is an omen from God. And this great hunter went out and he hunted this deer, and he found the deer, and he captured the deer, and he brought it home. Well, eventually the deer died. Okay, but right about that time, there was a war that was going on, and so they took this deer and they made a flag out of it. And wherever he took this flag, this standard, this banner, he won. And the people were united, and they came together under this banner. Well, guess what? This is exactly like the story of the flag raised by Moroni called the Title of Liberty. He made a banner out of his torn coat to inspire the Nephite people to defend their religion, freedom, peace, and their families. Again, another very specific parallel. I love this one, especially right around Christmas. This is an amazing parallel. So there's this story of a watchman, and he's up on a hill, and he sees the enemy coming, and so he comes down to the king, and he says, "King, the enemy's coming." And the king says, "Well, okay, go back up and keep watch." And the watchman saw the enemy drawing closer. He went back down to the king. He said, "King, the enemy's coming, getting closer." King said, "Okay, go back up." And this happened several times. Well, finally, the enemy was at the gate. They were there, ready to destroy. At that moment, Quetzalcoatl was born. This is a very unique parallel with Samuel the Lamanites. A watchman could be considered as a prophet. Watchmen are up on a hill. They are on the towers. They are watching for the rest of us. And Samuel says, "In 5 years, 5 years more cometh, and behold, then cometh the Son of God to redeem all those who believe on his name." And they did watch steadfastly for that day and that night and that day, which should be as one day as if there were no night. And it came to pass that there was a day set apart by unbelievers, that those who believed in the tradition should be put to death, except for the sign which should come to pass, which had been given by Samuel the prophet. So the enemy starting to get closer as the time's getting closer and closer to the 5 years that Samuel had predicted. The enemy's getting closer to kill all the believers. Well, it was that night Nephi prayed, and he got an answer, and he says, "Behold, I come into my own to fulfill all things which I have made known unto the children of men from the foundation of the world. Behold, the time is at hand, and this night shall the sign be given." And at that moment, Jesus was born. This is another fascinating. So Jesus was born of a virgin. Quetzalcoatl was also born of a virgin. There are several different myths of how she became pregnant with him, but his mother's name was Chimalma. Well, if we look at Chimalma, it can actually be translated into Hebrew. Chaim means life. Alma means young maiden in Hebrew. So Chimalma was the life-bearing young maiden who gave a virgin birth of Quetzalcoatl. There's also a story of him visiting. It says, "On the day we call Tecpotl," now remember that's Tecpotl is flint, "a great light came from the northeastern sky. It glowed for 4 days in the sky, then lowered itself to the rock. The rock can still be seen actually it's Teotitlán de Valle in Oaxaca. From the light there came a very great being, powerful being, who stood on the top of the rock and glowed like the sun in the sky. There he stood for all to see, shining day and night. When he spoke, his voice was like thunder, booming across the valley. Our old men and women, the astronomers and astrologers could understand him, and he could understand them. He, the solar beam, told us how to pray and fixed for us days of feasting. He then balanced the Book of Days, sacred calendar, and left vowing that he would always watch down upon us, his beloved people. Now, this story was supposedly told by the friar Juan de Cordova. I can't confirm this quote. I can't find the original quote. But what's also interesting is that when you look at the pictures, we do know this, that Quetzalcoatl was a well-built man of stern countenance. He was white and bearded, and he wore a long tunic. So, again, I can't confirm this quote, but I did some research on where this was supposed to happen. And the name Teotihuacan comes from the Nahuatl and means land of the gods. So Teotihuacan de Valle literally means the valley of the gods. So something happened here. There's a Catholic church that is built on top of the Zapotec ruins of a temple dedicated to Quetzalcoatl. And the natives actually have this old legend, this old myth of the demon Quetzalcoatl who visited them. And what we see is, of course, they called it a demon, but we see this coming through the corruption and through the apostasy. So something happened here. Even if it wasn't as described, I believe that they still at least saw Quetzalcoatl, and the stories have been lost to us today. So who was this preacher that came and visited them? Well, according to the stories, they actually believed that this man was the apostle, St. Thomas. And they believed that, well, St. Thomas, there was a story that he actually made it to Goa, India, and he taught the people of India. Now, if you think about it, the Spanish came and they were looking for the backside of India. They were trying to circumnavigate the earth, and they thought that they had found India. They didn't realize that they'd found a new world. They thought they'd found India. And that's why they called them the Indians, is because they were in India. Well, we know today that, India is a much bigger place than, the world is a much bigger place than what they knew back then. But Thomas made it to India, which means that they thought that Thomas was the one who had preached to them and given them the gospel. Well, that's why we have an island in the Caribbean named St. Thomas, after the apostle Thomas, who they believed made it that far. So they didn't put together that Christ was the one that had made it there, but they knew that they had been Christianized at least. So there's the island of St. Thomas. So more stories of Toltecs. He was a man who had come from a foreign country. Again, they thought this was Thomas. After he had arrived in the country, he began to gather disciples and build churches and altars. He and his disciples went out to preach in the villages, and they went up to the hills to preach, and their voices would carry 2 or 3 leagues like the sounding of trumpets. They preached in the valleys and performed wondrous things which must have been miracles. Astonished, the people called these men Toltecs. So they were named Toltecs after Tolpiltsin. This is where they get their name from. They called the men Toltecs, and they were the religious people. And these Toltecs proved his preaching by their miracles in their attempts to convert these people to the evangelical law. In other words, Christianity. Well, what's interesting is that Jesus, when he was in the old world, prophesied. And he said that other sheep I have which are not of this fold, them I must bring, and they shall hear my voice. Well, this is a direct parallel to that, or a fulfillment of that prophecy, because the Gentiles never heard the voice of Jesus. They never heard him speak. And if you look at this, the preachings of Tolpiltsin, he preached and all the people around about heard him. They shall hear my voice. Well, another concept of Tolpiltsin is that it is to be noted that this image, which is a tree, was honored in the name of the Father, which is translated as Tota. Thus we know that the people revered the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and called them Tota, Tolpiltsen, and Yolometo. These words mean our Father, our Son, and the heart of both, honoring each one separately and all three as a unit. Here we see that these people knew something of the Trinity. So here we have a direct correlation of what this is, that the Father was called Tota, and Tota Tapua is Nahuatl for our Father, our Lord. Well, Tota is where we get totem poles from. Interesting fact. And Tolpiltsen was the son of Tota. So his full name, Tolpiltsen, his full name is Teoaxtli, meaning one reed, and that's the year that he promised to return. One reed is the year when Cortez came, and so they thought, well, the great white god is returning again. So one reed, or Teoaxtli, is the year that Tolpiltsen Quetzalcoatl promised to come. It occurs only once every 52 years, so it's not like it's it's not a common year. Again, Cortez came during one reed, which is why they received him as their god. Well, he was, Teoaxtli Tolpiltsen Quetzalcoatl was recognized as a god and one of the creators of the earth preceding his birth. Before he was born, he was known as the god of air and water, wind and rain. His parents in heaven were called the creator couple, and Quetzalcoatl prays to them. Yes, the Aztecs had a heavenly mother. A young woman named Chimama was visited by a heavenly messenger and told that she would conceive and bear a son without knowing a man. Quetzalcoatl was slain in atonement for the primal sin, aka the original sin of Adam, and his blood, Quetzalcoatl's blood, saves mankind. He was crucified on a cross. Quetzalcoatl's cross was an X-shaped cruciform that he was nailed to. He had nails in his hands and feet, and if you actually look, you can see here some of the nails in his hands and in his feet. Had their sides pierced with a spear, or had his sides pierced with a spear, and water gushed out of the wound. He descended to the underworld, or to the land of the dead. He brought forth certain individuals with him out of the land of the dead, and he resurrected ancients trapped there from past eras. By this act, he struck down the prince of darkness and evil. And he visited this people after his resurrection, and he was seen in a glorious light. So there's a lot of parallels between Jesus Christ and Quetzalcoatl, Teoaxtli, Tolpiltsen Quetzalcoatl. And modern scholars say that the speed at which many Mesoamerican people converted to Christianity had much to do with Quetzalcoatl. Some people converted because they identified Cortez with their god, but they believed that the new rituals the Spanish missionaries introduced were simply another version of the practices used to worship Quetzalcoatl. But they also apostatized. We see that Bernardino de Sahagún, he at first, he refused to believe that they were Christians, but later wrote, he says, it seems quite possible that they were evangelized at some point in time in the past, and that after the death of their preachers, they became completely lost in the faith that they had been taught to them. So they had been converted, they had the gospel, and they apostatized. And this was prophesied. This is actually when you go back to Ixtlilxochitl, and he says, Huimac also prophesied that Quetzalcoatl's life conduct, which he at the beginning should be just and wise. Now remember, Quetzalcoatl started to become conflated with other people and even with the entire group of people, I believe. And so if we look at Huimac, which he said was 300 years, and we replace that Huimac with the people themselves as fulfilling a 300-year period, we can kind of see what's going on here. He says that which at the beginning of his life would be wise and just, And then when he reached middle age, he would be stubborn and unfortunate. Because of this, his nation would suffer great punishment from the heavens, and certain priests would rise up against him. After the manifestation of this sign, the destruction of the Toltecs would begin. So we have a 300-year period where they're prosperous, they're doing really well, but towards the end they start to fall away. And we know that it was prophesied that that was the end, the beginning of the end. To continue, it says, at that time the women of higher status would give themselves to carnal excesses, and in the temples the priests would break from their obligation and deliver themselves to quarreling and idolatry, and they would come to shed human blood on the altars. Because of all this, the irate earth would deny them sustenance and would throw them far away. She would punish them with lightning, frost, hail, and fire, and would instigate war among themselves, with which they would annihilate each other. This is what happened to the Toltecs. They annihilated each other. After all this, Quetzalcoatl said that he would return as a god from his travels, and that he would be recognized by everyone. Thanks to his knowledge of the Tonolamedal, Hoymak came to know all of this became true, and with time, everything came to pass through the divine will. Well, one of the things that we know that they started to practice was infant baptism. The goddess, the mother Chalchihuitl Ikui, she was the goddess of water and of baptism, and it was her tears that flooded the earth. Well, the midwife, after a baby was born, she baptized the baby and blessed the baby in the name of Chalchihuitl Ikui. And this baptism is exactly like what infant baptism is in the apostasy. It's remove the blotch, the filth, the evil of his mother and of his father. Taking away original sin. May the filth be washed away. May it be washed away. May it be destroyed in the way that it was assigned. Now, if you look at original sin is assigned to an infant. They aren't born sinful. The original sin is assigned to them through Adam. And so this infant baptism is taking away original sin as the same way that it had been assigned to them, which is another word of calling it imputed sin and imputed righteousness. Well, we come to know that they did start practicing human sacrifices, and if you remember the prophecy is once you start practicing human sacrifices, that's the beginning of the end. Well, part of the sacrifices it's actually quite fascinating in how they did their sacrifices. What they would do is they would take their god and they would bake an image of their god, and a human image. They would have him sitting on a throne. They would dress him in rich clothes and feathers, in these very ornate jewelry, and he would be a representation of their god, but it would also be made out of bread, out of a tuali bread. They would also bake other bones, like bread baked into the shape of bones, and they would put those bones in with their god up into this special room. And then they would take a victim, and they would plunge the knife, the sacrifice knife, into their victim. They would cut out his heart, but then they would throw the heart into the fire. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing, because this is a direct corruption of this verse here in 3 Nephi chapter 9, verse 20. And he says, "And ye shall offer a sacrifice unto me, a broken heart and a contrite spirit. And whoso cometh unto me with a broken heart and a contrite spirit, him I will baptize with fire and with the Holy Ghost." Well, that's exactly what they started to do, but they started to offer literal hearts and take the literal hearts and throw them into the fire. So this is a really unique parallel with the gospel of Jesus Christ. But even more, when you start to understand, the human sacrifices, they weren't just barbaric. They had a religious purpose, and this religious purpose for this ceremony was, after all this was done, they took their blood. I'm sorry, I don't know if I mentioned this, but so with the sacrificial victim, they took the blood of the sacrifice and they sprayed the blood on the idol, this beautifully dressed idol made of bread. And so after this was all over, they took the bones and the flesh and they broke them up into small fragments. And beginning with the elders, everyone received communion with this zoali bread, old and young men, women and old men and children. The people claimed that they had eaten the flesh and bones of their God. This was their sacrament. This was the Eucharist. This was the flesh and blood of God, flesh and blood of Jesus that had been given to them and had been corrupted. And they even went and they took pieces away, the sacrament away for their family members who couldn't make it there. Well, one of the things that they did after all this was done is they actually started to, the priest got up and he started to quote the Ten Commandments, but not just any Ten Commandments. It was the corrupted version of the Ten Commandments. He says, thou shalt fear, honor, and love the gods. Thou shalt not use the names of the gods on thy tongue or in thy talk at any time. Thou shalt honor the feast days, not the Sabbath day, but the feast days. Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother, thy kinsmen, priests, and elders. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not bear false witness. Now, how did the critics say, well, hey, the Spanish are the ones that told them all of this Christianity stuff? Well, how did the natives get the Ten Commandments from the Spanish, corrupt the Ten Commandments, and then include these corrupted Ten Commandments in their most sacred rituals without anyone noticing? That doesn't make sense that they got this from the Spanish. They had to have had this before the Spanish arrived. That's the only way it's possible. And yet we have another very specific parallel, that this Eucharist, this sacrament meeting, if you want to call it that this was pre-Columbian. This was from the apostasy and from the corrupted gospel that they had been living before. Well, here we get to the destruction of the Toltecs. So the story goes that the evil one, he goes in and he starts to cause all these, starts to wreak havoc among the different groups. He goes into Tula and he goes into the Toltecs and he starts to pull out, and you start to see this divide happening, and he's inciting both of them one to another. And many people joined in, and finally he moved against Tula. And if you think about this, Tula is Zarahemla. So he moves against Zarahemla, and he brings a great army that mocked the city's inhabitants and desecrated the sanctuaries. The Toltecs, or the Nephites, they'd been living in peace for 300 years. They weren't prepared for war. They were committed to peace, and many generations did not indulge in the arts of war, saw themselves at a great disadvantage, and were defeated. They all fell, old men, young men, children, and women. No one was spared. So we know that Zarahemla was wiped out, and because of that, because of that, the Toltecs, they started to run away. I mean, there were survivors, but Tula was destroyed. And so they ran away towards this area up here in Veracruz, near Xico. And they left the abandoned temples and palaces and all All of this fulfilled the prophecy that, O Tula, center of the earth, you will be left an orphan. Well, this is exactly what happened to the Nephites. Not only that, but in the Nephites, so they ran away. And if you look at down here, if this is Zarahemla and the land southward, in 350 AD, they made a treaty. The Nephites and Lamanites made a treaty, and the Nephites said, okay, you can have Zarahemla and all of the land southward, and you need to give us all of the land northward, which included desolation. It included the hill Cumorah. It included all these other cities in the land northward. And they gave all the land southward to the Lamanites, to the barbarians. So they were running away, and the Lamanites eventually started to pursue them. And wherever they went, the Lamanites were chasing after them and trying to kill them off. Well, this is exactly, it mirrors the Toltecs. The Toltecs, they were running away to Xico. King Hoimak fled with the surviving people and established a camp in Xico where he tried to present some kind of resistance. There his woman gave birth. Now, remember, Moroni was only 16 years old when he started leading the Nephites. And he would have been running at the time that he gave birth to Moroni, his son. And so we have another very direct parallel with Moroni and Mormon and King Mormon. And it says, for this reason he named the place after her. Tezcatlipoca, the evil guy, pursued them all the way to this place. Hoimak's followers had brought with them a serpent, which they venerated and demanded a human victim. Seeing themselves in a desperate situation, they agreed to sacrifice a man for her. Hoimak, on learning this abomination, removed himself from them and retired to a cave on the way to Chapultepec. So here we have another direct parallel. Mormon stopped leading the people because they were wicked, and he just decided, to give up on them, that they weren't worth leading and trying to save, that they'd given themselves up wholly to sin. And so he went to a cave. Well, this hill, Chapultepec, becomes very important to the people here. So Hill Chapultepec is actually, Chapultepec is actually called, it's translated as Grasshopper. So it's Grasshopper Hill. And here we see a picture of Hill Chapultepec. And this hill, it has a cave system where you could bury plates and perform translations, take all the plates, abridge records. It's got a cave system where you can go and be a prophet. It has a spring flowing from it with a land of many waters, rivers, and fountains, fountain being a spring. It has a Toltec altar on the top of it. So it was very important to the Toltecs. It's sacred to the Meshikas, and its name means grasshopper. Well, this is the hill where the Toltecs fought and lost. This is the last battle that wiped out the Toltecs. So what we have here is, we can see this is another codex, and right here, this is a grasshopper. So we have this picture of a battle taking place. These robed people, these are the Toltecs. This is what the Toltecs represented. And here the Chichimecas and the barbarians and all these others, these enemies, are coming to battle at Hill Chapultepec. And in the Codex Boturini, it has the same, there's this, they perform a sacrifice. If you remember the sacrifice that their leader decided, well, I'm not gonna lead you anymore because you sacrificed. Well, they went to Hill Chapultepec, this Grasshopper Hill. There was this battle. This is a symbol of war, where you have a Macoitl placed over under a shield, and you have this war happen, and they were cut off, and then you have all of these very sad-looking Toltec people here. This is where the battle occurred that wiped out the Toltecs. And we actually have a record of that. But first, let's look at the Book of Mormon here real quick. The Book of Mormon, they went to a land of many waters, rivers, and fountains. Now, King Mormon, he took them to an area, and he says that, and we did pitch our tents about, we did pitch our tents around about the hill Cumorah. That's kind of an important clause here. We did pitch our tents around about the hill Cumorah. And it was a land of many waters, rivers, and fountains. And we'd hoped to gain advantage over the Lamanites. And behold, 384 years had passed away, and we all gathered in all the remainder of our people unto the land of Cumorah. So this is the land of Cumorah. It's a land of many waters, rivers, and fountains. And it came to pass that when we had gathered in all of our people to the land of Cumorah, I, Mormon, began to be old. And knowing it to be the last struggle of my people, and having been commanded of the Lord that I should not suffer the records which had been handed down by our fathers, which were sacred, to fall into the hands of the Lamanites, for the Lamanites would destroy them, therefore I made this record out of the plates of Nephi, and hid them up in the hill Cumorah, all the records which had been entrusted to me by the hand of the Lord, save it were these few plates which I gave unto my son Moroni. So these few plates, so all the records were all of the things that he abridged, that Mormon abridged, and he brought together, and he made one book of golden plates, and he gave those golden plates to his son Moroni. So when we look at the record of the Toltecs being destroyed, it's through the Aztec histories, but this is the battle of the Toltecs. The Toltecs finally came to rest at Chapultepec, where with much dread they constructed a camp of huts. Another very unique parallel with the Book of Mormon, where they constructed their tents. Well, they fortified this as best they could, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but they chose a captain general among them. He was obedient, and they ordered the hill to be terraced with walls. And so they took this hill, and they started to defend it. They put all their women and their old men into the middle and up on the top of the hill. And this is where they were going to defend and try to stay alive. Well, that didn't happen. They were surrounded by all of their enemy. Their enemy came against them, and they repelled them one time, but the second time they came and they wiped them out. And that was the end of the Toltecs. So the destruction of the Toltecs, this was not a small number. The few Toltecs who were capable of escaping with their lives scattered themselves throughout the mountains and swamps. Their princes and artisans hid in the courts of the kingdoms where they were received. Tezcatlipoca, he stopped following them, stopped chasing them. The total number of dead was 3.2 million, and this marked the end of Tula and its kingdom. The city again was never inhabited, and that finally is how Hoymac's prophecy came to be. So one of the things, so in their stories, Mormon basically took his own life. It says that he hung himself on a tree. But this is what's kind of interesting. He says that when no one followed him, he committed suicide. But Hoymac's newborn son escaped with his nurse toward the Nonoalco deserts. Mormon had a son. His name was Moroni. Moroni survived and escaped. And he escaped with the plates that he had been given, the golden plates that he'd been given, and the records also of the Jaredites. And so this is kind of interesting because the Flight of Moroni. Now, if you look at, there's some criticism, or there's some, that people say, well, the Hill Cumorah, that's in New York, right? Well, no. The reason why is because if the last battle takes place in 385 AD, Moroni's not going to stick around. He's not going to stick around and try to translate between 385 and 401 AD. He abridged the 24 plates of the Jaredites and gave us ether. So you're not going to stick around in the same place trying to trying to translate additional plates. So in 401 AD, Moroni is fleeing. He is fleeing for his life. He says that the Lamanites are putting everyone to death who will not deny the Christ. And he says, I will not deny the Christ. So he's running away. This is not something that if the last battle happened in New York, he's not going to be sticking around New York. And so finally, in 321 AD, Moroni buries the plates. This took 36 years. He had 36 years to travel between the area in Mexico and the what we know as the Hill Cumorah in Palmyra, New York. That's not the same Hill Cumorah. There are two Hill Cumorahs. Hill Cumorah in Mexico is where the plates of Mormon were buried. Moroni, his son, escaped and took 36 years to travel to New York and buried the plates in upstate New York where Joseph Smith could find them. Well, where is this land of many waters, rivers, and fountains? You look, there's this huge lake. It's called Lake Texcoco. It's a lake that's 120 kilometers wide, or about 80 miles long, and huge lake. Well, the natives eventually returned to the area, and they started to build a civilization. Well, Tenochtitlan became the capital of the Aztec nation. Tenochtitlan is right here, their capital, right there in the middle of the water. Today, Lake Texcoco has almost completely disappeared. This lake is gone. It does not exist anymore, which is why we can't find the land of many waters, rivers, and fountains. It doesn't exist any longer. The landscape has changed. In its place now, where this lake used to be, is a city of 12 million people known as the Mexicans. And that is Mexico City. Chapultepec is right smack in the middle of Mexico City. That lake is gone, and it is filled with people now. So this is another fascinating parallel here. So if the Mexicans are the remnants of the Jews and the Hebrews who had been Christianized, then we have found the Messiah, which is being interpreted the Christ. Christ, or more accurately, Christo, means the anointed one in Greek. Messiah, or more accurately, the Mashiach, literally means the anointed one in Hebrew. So Christo and Mashiach means the same thing, the anointed one. They're just different languages. So the titles of Christ and Messiah are equivalent. It follows then that Christians and the Messians, or the Mashiachans, are the same thing. Well, the Nahuatl X is pronounced with a soft SH. So those in the New World would say, instead of Mexicans, or instead of the Mexicans, they would say the Mexicans, or the Mashiachans. Well, the Book of Mormon testifies of Jesus Christ, and it says, all those who were true believers in Christ took upon them gladly the name of Christ, or Christians as they were called, because of their belief in Christ who would come. Well, what if we change that? What if we change the translation of that and say, all those who were true believers in the Messiah took upon them gladly the name of Messiah, or Mashiachans as they were called, because of their belief in the Messiah who would come. If this is true, then the Mexicans were the Mashiachans, or the literal Christians of the ancient world in Mexico, in Mesoamerica. I like that. Quetzalcoatl, in its literal sense, means serpent of precious feathers, but in the allegorical sense, it means wisest of men. Well, did you know that in the Old Testament, in Proverbs, Jesus was known as the wisdom? He was the wisest of men. In the Mesoamerican area, the Quetzal bird represents air. The coatl, the snake, represents water. So Quetzal is a bird, coatl is snake, and it represents the god of air and water. It's right in their coat of arms, the Mexican coat of arms. A bird, snake, this is Quetzalcoatl. It's in the coat of arms of Mexico. Well, he is represented as the god of air and water. It's also on their flag. Well, if you also look at, this is confirmed in the Mayan area, where he was known as Kukulkan. Kukulkan, the kukul bird, represents air. The kan is a snake that represents water. It also is kind of fascinating because this is where we get hurricane from. Hurukan. Huru is air and kan is water. This is where we get a hurricane from. So what we have is the god of air and water, who was the controller of hurricanes, and whenever a hurricane would come, he could calm the storm, or he could cause it to occur. He could cause hurricanes. Well, when we look in the old world, so the men marveled, saying, "Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Jesus was known as the god of air and water, who could calm storms on the seas. This is one of my favorite things here. So Jesus Christ is known as the bright morning star. He says, "I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and morning star." Now, what is the morning star? Well, the morning star is actually the planet Venus. It comes up in the morning. We know this, that it's represented as the planet Venus. Well, interestingly enough, every 104 years, the star of Venus actually moves back and forth, and it creates in the sky, as every 104 years, when it makes its full rotation, it actually makes a pentagram in the sky, a five-pointed star, perfect five-pointed star, as a pentagram. Now, we often think that, well, the pentagram is the symbol of the occult and of Satan. No, Satan is the fallen morning star. He is trying to overtake Jesus as the morning star. Jesus is the true morning star. He is known as the pentagram, and this is actually seen in some of the ancient writings in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In the 14th century, the pentagram, or they call it the pentagram or the pentacle, was associated with Jesus Christ using the 5 wounds of Christ, one in each hand, in each foot, and in the side. And so there's 5 wounds of Christ. So Jesus was known, or was symbolized by the pentagram. And this is why we have the pentagram on all these churches. These churches show the pentagram. I mean, we have this one up here is a Lutheran church in Germany. This one down here is a Presbyterian church in Texas. Here we have a pentagram with this is a Methodist church in Indiana. We have all these other ancient pentagrams all over the world that represent Jesus Christ as the pentagram. Satan is trying to take it over. It's not Satan's symbol. It is Jesus Christ's symbol. Don't let him do that. No longer let Satan control the pentagram, because this is the symbol of Jesus Christ. It's even on our Christmas trees. If we look at the 5-pointed Christmas star on our Christmas trees, this is representative of Jesus Christ. Well, guess what? This is also true in the Mesoamerican world, in the New World. The Aztec calendar is completely based on Quetzalcoatl. There is a legend where Quetzalcoatl goes on to the east, and he threw himself on a burning pyre, and he became the smoking star, and he rose up, and he became Venus. And so up here in the sky, we see the morning star as Quetzalcoatl, but it's also Jesus Christ. And it's the same person, the same being that is represented by that. It's so prevalent in the Aztecs that they base their entire calendar on the planet Venus. So their calendar is 52 years long. It's a 52-year-long calendar, and Teoaxtli comes once every 52 years. One read comes every 52 years. The way that it goes through, there's 13 rounds and 13 times 4, so 52 years. But the thing is that if you take 52 and times it by 2, you have 104. If you remember, it's 104 years that Venus goes around the sun and ends up in the exact same spot in the sky. So every 104 years, it completes a perfect pentagram in the sky. Well, this is the Aztec calendar, and it perfectly mirrors Jesus Christ. And I just want to testify of this, that Jesus Christ is my Savior. He's my Redeemer. He is the one I love. To me, it is so important that he loved the whole world, not just the people in the Old Testament, not just the Romans and the Gentiles. He loved the entire world enough that he was willing to sacrifice his life for them, for you, for everybody who has ever lived on this planet. And because of that, he loved the people in the New World so much that he visited them and he taught them his gospel. And we can see that their history matches the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith could not have known these things. It just is impossible unless he had some way of traveling using a Star Trek transporter and a universal translator to get to Spain and to research all this in their museums. These were not available. These stories were not available to Joseph Smith. There is nothing in the surrounding areas that even discuss a fraction of what I have shared. And I'm going to go through, and I'm going to go through Codex Boturini because it's like the Book of Mormon as a secular history of the Book of Mormon from their viewpoint. So I'm going to be doing that. So like and subscribe this video, and show. So I'll be able to give you more information on this. I'm going to go through some of the criticisms that have been addressed by this. So I'll create a whole new video on all the criticisms. Right now, I'm just kind of giving you a large overview that, hey, the Book of Mormon is history, and I want to testify of that. The Book of Mormon is a true book. It is a actual history book of the people who lived here in the Americas, the Toltecs, their trials, their beliefs. They were a real people, and we need to honor them because we have their history in the Book of Mormon. And I want to share that with you. I testify of it. If you haven't read the Book of Mormon, I challenge you to do that. Compare it with what I've said about the Toltecs, and it's a true book, and it will change your life if you let it. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.